Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means, is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. federal court and Canadian superior courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence due to my typically gentle nature is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I'm publicly announcing that I've decided to formally add to my mailing list the attorney Andrew Esquire, also known online as Legal Mindset, as well as the attorney who handled what was supposed to be my defense in the criminal case prosecuting me for what the Canadian government so egregiously negligently labeled criminal harassment and essentially forced me to plead guilty to, under duress of indefinite wrongful detainment several years ago. That attorney's name is Vincent Richia from the law firm Hicks Adams LLP. I'm formally requesting an official response from both Andrew Esquire as well as Vincent Richia in the form of private correspondence sent to my official email address, thedarkredpillsocial@gmail.com, as well as giving permission to Andrew Esquire to also give a public official response on his YouTube channel, Legal Mindset, as he may see fit at his discretion. I've heard Hassan recently said Legal Mindset isn't even a lawyer, or called him a fake lawyer, and I decided to watch Legal Mindset's video responding to it. It was recommended to me, and I figured why not, so I figured I should comment briefly on it as well. It covers multiple topics of potential interest in relation to my perspective on, I feel. So, first off, Legal Mindset mentions typically ignoring defamation that may be done to him by smaller channels or perhaps less serious individuals in general, which may or may not have been done with undertones of attempting to discredit what I recently said about him on my last release. I'll make sure I elaborate and clarify on what exactly I meant when I called him a massive fraud, because it's not the more explicitly defamatory seeming kind of statement Hassan made that essentially appears to delusionally ignore Legal Mindset's formal credentials to practice law in a commercial capacity. I'm aware that personal attacks, which calling someone a fraud may very well be seen as to many, are typically utilized when one is incapable of making an objective or informed argument because you don't have any real merit to try to discredit the person. And I agree that's likely what Hassan was doing to Legal Mindset when calling him a fake lawyer. To be clear, I wasn't calling Legal Mindset a fraud in the sense of trying to say he's not even a lawyer. I don't doubt that he has substantial legal knowledge and probably does actually have a formal license to practice law in a formal courtroom, according to him, especially to practice in the state of Florida. I was calling him a fraud in the sense that I'm pretty sure he presents himself as someone who actually cares about integrity and morals, even beyond just in a legal sense. And I'd argue his fixation on what I'd say is more so clout chasing by covering Hassan drama and other larger creator drama instead of giving me any attention, despite my objective merit proving it, lumps Legal Mindset into the same scummy category as many others who do so, I'd say, in most cases, demonstrably, fully consciously, and intentionally for selfish gain. It was a criticism on perhaps a more subtle aspect of his branding, or perhaps online presence as a whole, along with perhaps his personal perception of his own identity, not an attempt to discredit him in terms of merit in legal knowledge, nor in possessing a formal license to practice law. For him to even attempt to claim I defamed him, as perhaps he might have been subtly doing as part of his response to Hassan's recent behavior towards him, is either a misunderstanding of what I was saying, a bad faith argument intentionally misrepresenting what I was really saying, or perhaps a bit of both. I'm not really sure, and I honestly don't know or particularly care whether or not Legal Mindset even knows of me or that I've mentioned him before on this podcast. I definitely don't consider myself to have enough merit, at least as far as his public behavior goes, to believe that Legal Mindset pays any attention to my content compared to someone like, say, Kimmy or Jamie. As for the distinction between a lawyer and an attorney, I myself have long been well aware of it. The reason why I'd call myself an attorney, despite not having a formally government-issued license to practice law, is because I understand the law well enough to understand that statutory law is built upon constitutional law, and constitutional law actually states that it's illegal for a state to require a license to practice activities that should be a basic human right. Not a lot of people know this, but it's actually illegal that the government forcefully imposes licenses for several things that should be inherent rights, like operating a motor vehicle or defending yourself in a court of law. The legal methodology for getting around this is understanding exactly what certain words mean and then navigating the legal complexities, like for example in operating motor vehicles. There's a legal distinction between driving, as in doing it in a commercial capacity, versus traveling, which is non-commercial in nature. Driving requires a license for a lot of reasons that make sense and are lawful, whereas traveling technically does not, although most people effectively treat their non-commercial traveling as if it's commercial driving as far as the law is concerned. The government relies on a combination of ignorance of the law and intimidation of facing difficulty from law enforcement to achieve compliance with that manner of operation for a typical person. Similarly, while there are reasons that perhaps make sense to have a standard that's gated by a license to demonstrate legal credentials, it's unlawful to necessarily require a license for a living being to even simply be capable of providing for themselves a legal defense in a court of law at a fundamental level. Because I rely a lot more on the jurisdiction of constitutional law than statutory law, I don't concern myself as much with formal licensing to operate in a typical commercially sanctioned capacity, but I consider my level of knowledge of the law to have reached a certain point where I can perhaps be considered to have some form of license or equivalent knowledge. I'm still effectively practicing law in an official capacity and consider myself to be very much capable of doing so in a formal physical courtroom to a non-trivial extent if absolutely necessary. The reason my practice typically doesn't reach formal physical courtrooms is because government-sanctioned formal physical courthouses effectively function as corporate tribunals, and they tend to look quite disfavorably on anyone without a formal license. Also, all the filing I do is on public record on social media, and perhaps may be often seen as to be out of their jurisdiction, even when it perhaps otherwise might not have been, if considering certain criteria like location. I'm well aware of all these things for the record. While Hassan's language of calling Legal Mindset a fake lawyer is technically inaccurate based on the definition of what a lawyer is, perhaps he was alluding to the fact that someone actually extremely deeply versed in law beyond what perhaps is just taught in formally government-sanctioned law schools. Especially such an individual running a channel like Legal Mindset should know the kinds of things I know about the law instead of just being obsessed with statutory law and contexts enforcing it through jurisdictional manipulation tactics that administrative courts often employ. In that sense, I also consider Legal Mindset fake in that, like most lawyers and attorneys, he seems a lot more generally preoccupied with his practice of law, padding his professional record, boosting his status, and generally selfishly gaining financially, socially, and personally, rather than truly operating fully in good faith with how he interacts with the legal system as a whole. Also, I want to make it completely clear that I'm explaining and clarifying this entirely for my own interests, exclusively on and for my own behalf, and not to somehow defend Hassan. While I myself am not particularly concerned about facing a defamation lawsuit from Legal Mindset, especially since I understand the nuance of public figures being held to a higher standard for defamation lawsuits than private individuals, Hassan perhaps very much should be concerned about it, particularly if he's going to do his typical kind of unhinged terrorism supporting type behavior in how he generally deals with people, now to Legal Mindset as well. From how Hassan claimed Legal Mindset spends most of his time talking about trans people, I get the impression he was implying that Legal Mindset has been quite substantially engaging in discussions related to me behind the scenes. Now, I have no evidence personally to substantiate that assertion, and perhaps Hassan was blatantly lying or unknowingly perpetuating gossip he'd heard, but I certainly see it as a very real possibility that Legal Mindset has in reality already known of my existence and been aware of the kind of situation I've been in for quite some time already. I've never particularly cared what Legal Mindset does in his personal life, so I'm really hoping he doesn't take some weird, creepy angle towards me, choosing to now add him to my mailing list and give him some attention publicly on this podcast with how I've been mentioning him. I imagine he's capable of keeping things professional between us. I do care about avoiding violating the terms of service of the YouTube platform myself, like most others on it. However, I find myself in a quite exceptionally difficult and nuanced situation where perhaps quite questionable behavior has felt rather warranted to me on more than one occasion already, as anyone keeping up with my past releases would be aware. I'd like to note that I try my very best to keep any such behavior to a minimum, and special attention should be paid to the quite literally life-threatening nature of the life circumstances I currently face, where I've literally had multiple hitmen come after me so blatantly to the point that I've documented more than one occasion of someone explicitly talking about murdering me on government-owned property of a government-owned building, which I imagine should be visible and or hearable from records of surveillance done by at least one government-owned camera monitoring that building, both inside of and outside of the building. I certainly wouldn't say I support Hassan waving around his gun at some guy on stream, but that's not something I'm particularly inclined to get myself involved in. I myself do not watch Hassan's streams, nor talk at all in his Twitch chat, so unless he's going to randomly throw threats at me for what I'm saying on this podcast or something, I'm not particularly concerned about him randomly waving a gun around on stream towards me. Not saying what Hassan did was okay, but I myself do not mess around with the cryptocurrency space, nor do I know either of the individuals Hassan effectively displayed substantial hostility towards there, so I really don't know if that guy might have actually deserved what Hassan did or not. Anyways, I have matters I consider much more important than that to cover in this release, so let's get to it. I'm hearing someone extremely guilty of egregious divination abuse is still trying hard to abuse spirituality to frame me for being extremely greedy and having some kind of compromise of my integrity for some kind of material gain. At this point, I consider the root cause of this ongoing attempt to force me to care about Chloe Chan Kin's lack of desire to take accountability for her extremely narcissistic attitude and behavior towards me all these years to be egregious defamation of me that she's engaging in behind the scenes, where false narratives are being perpetuated of me that attempt to frame me as having been trying to entrap Chloe all along into essentially being forced to have to pretend to consent to engaging in romantic and or sexual relations with me, likely trying to egregiously misrepresent my lack of already having a formally licensed attorney on my mailing list as some kind of supposed evidence to substantiate it. Well, that should be made much more clear to be completely false now that I've added not one, but two formally licensed attorneys, one licensed in the United States and one licensed in Canada. I've never considered my podcast as singing, nor ever considered it heavily music related in general. Same with anything to my mailing list ever in general. And while I've never been getting paid anything to do it, I also wouldn't say I ever considered it a hobby either. While I'll admit I've actually tried to release music before, very long ago, many years in the past, it was never something I was particularly passionate about doing. And at this point, I believe the only reason I ever felt particularly compelled at all to do it was because of how isolated I'd become due to Chloe's defamation of me to Lily, where I was basically feeling Lily's passion for creating music in some weird indirect manner, or something like that. The energy I saw spiritually that was attempting to frame my releases on this podcast as some kind of singing and or dancing was heavily operating from what I perceived as Lily's energy. For the record, I don't believe all talk about me is negative. The biggest issue I believe to currently be facing is that anyone that might be speaking anything about me never says it to my face, nor ever says it explicitly, publicly, online, on any account I can actually meaningfully associate with a real living being. So I'm left extremely isolated and, at best, stuck struggling with spiritual insights and self-reflection to even attempt to figure out what egregious defamation is being inflicted on me that attempts to justify me being treated how I've been treated all these years. I've never been trying to impact more people at the expense of my own peace and happiness long term. It doesn't matter how many I might have impacted, how or potential therein, if I'm willing to sacrifice myself like that ever. I'm not willing and never believed I should be. I've never and don't appreciate that people seem to enjoy watching me struggle, to actually see how much value I add to the world and how important I am. I don't hold myself back out of fear of being seen and perceived. I'm being intentionally sabotaged entirely against my consent, and my extreme awareness of that makes me rather weary of any communication with anyone where I'm not publicly releasing things on this podcast. It's been so extremely, egregiously taken advantage of, exploited, and weaponized against me far too many times in the past already, and I'm absolutely convinced I need to see explicit public accountability related to this conflict from both Kimmy and Jamie, at the very least, before I find private correspondence of any kind with anyone that isn't a licensed attorney to make any kind of real sense to me beyond the essentially forced, shallow, in person, minimal interactions absolutely necessary with strangers in order for me to function in society while being homeless. I've never and don't consider myself some kind of comedian. I've never been trying to be funny in my position. I extremely clearly express on this podcast. There's nothing wrong with having a sense of humor, especially if it's healthy, but I'm well aware there's a time and place for it. With how heavy my life circumstances weigh on me, and have been only increasingly so ever since I determined starting this podcast was absolutely necessary, I've never seen any place for humor in my life. It's not something I'm particularly fixated on, but rather something I'm quite extremely deeply disturbed. I even feel needs to be clarified at this point, as if even despite everything I've done, my entire existence is still being seen and treated like one huge, complete joke. Although it really shouldn't have ever even really been in question, it seems I actually need to even more explicitly, extremely clearly state that saying I want to rub up on Kimmy's latex clad butt extensively, frequently, forever, isn't any kind of joke nor any kind of metaphor. There's no hidden meaning, alternative meaning, ulterior motive, or intended entertainment value of any kind in me saying it. I've always meant it very much literally and extremely seriously, with utmost warmth and joy towards her existence when I even think of even just the serious, real possibility of it actually happening. And yes, I've wanted it extremely badly with Chloe Chan Kim as well, like I would also with any other woman I find extremely physically attractive. But I've also never been trying or willing to compromise my integrity or at all ruin my life to experience it or even have a real chance to experience it. Despite how it's literally by far the most arousing and appealing sexual activity of all to me, I've never actually gotten to do it at all with anyone in my entire life, and that's extremely deeply disappointing and disturbing beyond words to me. There's absolutely zero real evidence I'm an alcoholic and or drug addict, and I've never been faking happiness. I'm hearing someone with such issues has been egregiously faking being a spiritualist with pure energy, but it's all an act and people didn't expect them to be so fake. I'm hearing it was all because they didn't want to let someone go because they escaped. It really sounds like Chloe was trying extremely hard not to let go of me after realizing I left her alone and didn't want anything to do with her after how she rejected me back in high school. I wanted extremely clearly known that she absolutely can't charm me at all, spiritually and or otherwise. There's no way out of the absolute nightmare of karma coming for her. Even God can't save her after forming such a demonic attachment trying to hunt me so criminally for selfish gain. I'm hearing she knows being completely honest to anyone would completely destroy her even faster. So it seems elaborating further on both her current state as well as reasoning for my past behavior related to her, especially that which has previously resulted in criminal charges being placed on me, seems warranted at this time. She needs to come begging me and confessing everything in order to have any real chance at mitigating the horrible negative karma she has coming at all. But she knows that I know even her most pleasant approach would be so disgustingly fake that she knows it's not even worth trying. So she's trying to avoid attention and hide instead. I wouldn't even say her avoidance of me is so much a pride thing. It's more like she's in way too deep with betraying me and criminally trying to destroy me for selfish gain entirely against my consent, and she's so screwed she obviously knows it extremely well in reality. Since she's constantly been lying about me to basically everyone all these years, she'd obviously warp any explicit public mention of her brand from me to further try to selfishly gain at my expense against my consent. I don't want to risk her trying to twist it like I owe her something and or I'm trying to advertise for her, which is why I don't mention it publicly here. But for the record, I'm completely okay with someone prominent publicly naming and shaming her public brand for the purpose of exposing her and destroying her life for her extremely malicious criminal behavior towards me if they feel that's appropriate. Not that I particularly expect anyone to do so. I really want to make sure my position on Chloe Chankin is extremely clear. She has absolutely zero sincere desire and or intent to ever consent to sexual intimacy with me or any kind of at all consensual romantic and or sexual involvement with me that I'd ever actually want and be willing to tolerate. That's clearly always been the case and will always be the case. I've never been trying to force her to be at all romantically and or sexually involved with me, and there's absolutely zero real evidence to at all substantiate assertions otherwise. There's absolutely nothing that could ever happen at this point that would convince me to ever again at all even seriously entertain the possibility that she has anything except absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent towards me, and I'd never try to force someone like that to be romantically and or sexually involved with me. I seriously just want her completely out of my life permanently. I'm absolutely certain and have been already for a very long time now. So much, including literally everything I've ever been criminally charged for, could have been entirely avoided if Chloe wasn't egregiously defaming me and intentionally inflicting emotional distress on me behind my back ever since high school. It could have even been completely avoided if Kimmy or Jamie or anyone else aware of what she was doing had ever actually told me about it before it kept going on for so long that I was being disrespected and neglected so egregiously by literally everyone I'd ever been at all close to in my life that I felt compelled to extremely seriously publicly threaten to single-handedly destroy the entire world because all of humanity seemed like a reeking dumpster fire nightmare completely beyond redemption. Yet I've had to live with unbelievable, entirely undeserved shame and guilt as if I'm an unfathomably demonic criminal, while those projecting that quality within themselves onto me have been at liberty to run rampant as they relentlessly, extremely viciously terrorize my life, increasingly blatantly and unapologetically. To this day, I'm being made to feel like I'm mentally ill for seeing the truth clearly and trying to speak up about it. The extent of egregious abuse, disrespect, and neglect that combined from everyone in my life to result in that document that ultimately led to my arrest effectively should be seen as nothing short of criminal entrapment of me by, at the very least, Chloe Chan Kin, Mary Aslin, and Dixon Aslin. I was framed as an unhinged, mentally ill criminal for threatening them effectively in self-defense to bring attention to their abuse, while they were allowed to continue to the point that Dixon committed life insurance fraud for $300,000 under my name, knowingly entirely against my consent, among other things, and Mary knowingly participated in identity theft and marriage fraud, where my biological cousin Vivian Saudet and my biological uncle John Saudet fraudulently married me and Vivian as some kind of extremely criminal contractual deal to ruin my life and sabotage everything I'd been trying to build, while all my biological relatives and everyone else that knew kept it completely hidden from me and tried to set me up constantly to fall into all kinds of traps that would absolutely ruin my life and destroy my future. Even when I approached Chloe, the one day I did, many years ago, that I was charged for as criminal harassment, I hadn't done so with malicious intent, and there isn't actually any real evidence that proves otherwise. Me being understandably angry and confused by the treatment I was experiencing from everyone at all somehow close to me, online and offline, doesn't necessarily mean I approached her with malice, and I don't find it appropriate at all that me feeling the need to receive clarity has been framed and treated as if I was being reckless in my behavior. It should be noted that her behavior, choosing to mock me, humiliate me, and gaslight me, that I was extremely delusional and messed up for even trying to communicate respectfully with her in person about it, even once, before snapping how I did with publicly releasing what the courts called a manifesto, was a very much non trivial reason why it ever even happened in the first place. She had countless opportunities over the years to reconsider being increasingly malicious towards me, to the point I'd assert it's conspiracy to murder me, and yet she doubled down every time and chose to be even more evil and cruel every time, and still to this day. At this point, it seems to me that how I treat Lily is going to, in a sense, allow the world to see a reflection of the reality of how messed up and fake Chloe Chan Kin really is. I suspect Chloe's egregious defamation of me might be suggesting to Lily that there might ever come some point where I'd confess some kind of feelings for Lily and expect Lily to embrace them, perhaps even abandoning Michael, and that I'd perhaps then expect Chloe to crash out or hit rock bottom type of thing. That's most certainly never happening. Not because Lily isn't extremely physically attractive to me, she totally is, but I've also never been trying to break apart a clearly quite serious long term public relationship, especially one I honestly hardly even know much about, besides that it seems Lily's actually quite satisfied overall with the arrangement she has going on currently, and would probably only be quite troubled if I secretly felt very differently about her than I've been saying I do. I believe it's very possible Lily's already been seeing how I've been dealing with this conflict and expecting me to choose to deal with her like this as a very real possibility. I imagine she likely still questions my personality a lot, to the point she'd feel rather uncomfortable confidently believing things about me without personal interactions that clearly contradict things Chloe told Lily I was inclined towards, but knows Chloe must have been lying quite badly if I'm choosing to behave how I am and only continue to follow through in a manner displaying dignity and integrity that shouldn't even be possible to fake if I was really the kind of person Chloe has been claiming I am. I imagine Chloe's going to have to come off really arrogant and or really cowardly, and likely just strange in general, trying to operate with Kimmy and Jamie in an energy stolen from me, knowingly entirely non-consensually. She'll probably come off quite extremely obnoxiously attention seeking and really competitive. A lot of really unpleasant and possibly in some cases even outright unbearable traits that they'd see in reality wouldn't be present in me if they actually gave getting to know me personally without prejudice a real chance, instead of believing Chloe somehow knows me very well or ever really did. I don't feel any regret whatsoever for what I've been desiring, nor do I have any hidden desires I feel at all compelled to share about anything. Chloe's likely finding herself stuck and tied up in her own lies about me, even if she doesn't act like it. Perhaps she feels like she lost her soul with her selfish desires towards me. Perhaps she feels she's suffering from a lot of heartbreak at this time, although I doubt she'll admit it truthfully, if at all. I myself don't resonate with any of those feelings. I'm not having a change of heart about how I see and wish to deal with anyone at this time, although Kimmy, Jamie, and Chloe might be experiencing that especially strongly towards each other and or me, or they will be increasingly so in the not so distant future. I don't feel like I overthought anything and created any kind of self-sabotage dynamic in my life at all. Although I imagine Kimmy, Jamie, and or Chloe likely feel otherwise about their own lives, even if they won't admit it to anyone. Chloe might be trying to act heartbroken because I supposedly had a change of heart, but that's a complete lie. At best, it's unapologetically extremely selfish and inconsiderate projection of herself onto me, and otherwise, it's fully conscious and intentional, utmost malicious manipulation. I don't know or care to try to find out which, but I'd heavily suspect it's the latter. If Kimmy feels heartbroken because she thinks even once attending a convention with Jamie and Chloe present means she's permanently damaged beyond repair the prospects of the connection I've always wanted with her, she's not necessarily correct, and I'm definitely still interested in hearing her out privately if she's going to offer some kind of actually meaningful explanation. If anyone else feels heartbroken because they expected me to show interest in them and or be warmer towards them in general at this time, they're either extremely misinformed, extremely mentally ill, or both. For the record, I've been feeling like it's extremely risky for anyone to know where I am because of the moves they might be trying to make, which is why I haven't been sharing my location with anyone privately and or publicly. I consider anyone who isn't some kind of government official protecting me, knowing my location, to be undesirable. I'm hearing someone who might have shared an address I privately gave them in the past with someone extremely jealous of me, perhaps a lot more than the person sharing knew, put my safety at risk, possibly intentionally, and now they might be unable to figure out where I'm at when they might have wanted to recently because it became too dangerous for them to know. They wanted me to be afraid. They promised others I'd be afraid I'd die and might now themselves be starting to get afraid they will die as a result. From how things seemed to me, Chloe wanted me so extremely deprived, unstable, and terrified for my life because she was extremely deviously trying to coerce me into apologizing for something I shouldn't have to apologize for at all, so she could try to validate eternal energy siphoning control over my life like a massive narcissist. She was trying to lie that I'm extremely fake and a lot more extroverted than my willingness to tolerate isolating myself from others when under extreme scrutiny I've been asserting is objectively undeserved might have otherwise suggested. I'm actually just an ambivert, but she'd try to make me seem fake anytime behavior that she hoped would reveal me as extroverted or introverted in some manner she could tried to claim I was reliably predictable to her because of didn't add up to what she was saying about me. She was hoping I was incompetent and incapable of supporting myself in the face of her extremely narcissistic intentional isolating of me. She doesn't know how to be actually useful at all to me without forcing herself to be useful in my life, or hold some kind of important position in my life by eliminating other options I should have in my life. She's been stalking me all this time, trying to sabotage everything good I've been trying to build for myself. So I'm constantly stuck with feeling heartbroken over her and feeling crazy for it, as if there's something seriously wrong with me. She wanted me extremely, desperately in need of a friend, and she likely promised someone I'd be like that. She most likely promised Kimmy and or Jamie, maybe Lily, that I'd desperately come to Chloe and basically beg her to give me any kind of sign on how I can gain her favor and make the relentless, perpetual, sheer hellish nightmare that constantly led me back to her stop. She wanted to gain off forcing me to apologize for something I shouldn't have to apologize for, that she was hoping to trap me into feeling was unavoidable to submit to her in regards to. But I broke free of that. She had absolutely zero real desire and or willingness to compromise ever. It was an extremely narcissistic, abusive attempt to brutally control my life and forcefully get me to validate her in a manner that would brutally rob me of credibility and dignity, and very possibly, absolutely unconditionally lead to me getting murdered regardless. If not murdered, she wanted to trap me into living a life without my soul and in an extremely unhealthy codependent relationship with her, where she's not at all being fair, decent, or pleasant towards me in reality, but expects me to let her act like she's wonderful and I was somehow this massive piece of garbage that deserves how I've been getting treated like absolute subhuman filth for the last over decade of my life because of Chloe's egregious nonstop defamation of me behind my back that everyone that was once in my life were all so goddamn selfish that they only wanted to help her perpetuate for one reason or another. Personally, I believe her plan all along was to have me murdered before I'd even learn enough of what she'd been doing to even realize she possibly wanted an apology. And it's only because I've survived long after she was already hoping and expecting I'd be dead that she's now trying to change her story and make it seem like she intended for me to remain alive all along in order to apologize for something to her that she's egregiously lying she deserves some kind of apology for. If I had to take a wild guess at what Chloe would be egregiously defaming me by claiming I'd ever possibly owe anyone an apology for, she's probably trying to act like I was a horrible romantic partner and owe her to desperately apologize to her for ever showing interest in and or pursuing anyone other than her, especially Kimmy. In reality, anytime I've ever shown interest in and or pursued Chloe in any capacity, at any point in time, even as far back as high school, she's just left me in this extremely uncomfortable, detrimental state of experiencing cold violence from her, and as if any interest in her and or pursuit of her romantically and or sexually would just make me come off like a stalker, pervert, creep with malicious intent towards her, that the only possible realistic response from her to is to shun me for and humiliate me for in front of anyone and everyone that would listen. The one time I tried long ago to give her a final chance to prove she wasn't actually that extremely narcissistic, evil, cruel, and fake, I ended up with criminal harassment charges. It really wasn't clear at all until I had that one on one encounter with her. But after I saw how she was clearly, fully consciously, and intentionally, narcissistically trying to flirt with me and lead me on and make me believe she wanted physical sexual contact with me, but then pulled away as if I'd violated her, even just trying to gently touch her in a manner her intense flirting beforehand suggested to me she would have wanted, enjoyed, been okay with, and been receptive to, as indication she actually liked me and wanted to date me after I'd explicitly expressed interest in dating her to her, I knew something was seriously off about her. Even after seeing her behave like that at the time, I never expected her to start stalking me behind the scenes and literally trying to completely destroy my life after that. I never expected Jerry Cow, Matthew Wu, and my biological brother Kristen and others from my past to help her either. Even despite everything I've been through, I still believe in myself to overcome everything that's been thrown at me. It's reached a point where criminal entrapment from biological relatives and other nobodies from my past has extended into entrapment by police, the FBI, and many celebrities, with various traps having been set up to try to force me into criminal behavior both online and offline. It's only increasingly evident to me that I've had many trying to make me completely run out of any money and ability to obtain it, and then constantly intentionally inflict emotional distress on me, emotionally dysregulate me, and leave me aggravated, sad, and confused to the point that I lose my will to live and give up and end up getting murdered by some hitman while being framed as deserving it. Nobody should be believing someone just saying they saw me do things that compromise my integrity. But gossip and defamation of me seems to hold more weight in practical consequences in my life than the reality of who I am, no matter how many lies I disprove. This is beyond ridiculous at this point. Clearly, police know where they can find me if they're sending off duty or undercover police officers to sit at a table beside the table I'm sitting at, bicker about TTC bylaws, and try to intimidate me that law enforcement officials are going to show up anytime and arrest me and take me away. Clearly, if they had any actually adequate reason and evidence to arrest me and press criminal charges on me and have me found guilty in court that I'm not thoroughly proving is government corruption with what I've been releasing on this podcast, I'd be in jail right now already. But instead, I'm facing constant intimidation, hitmen and would-be hitmen regularly coming into my energy and trying to intimidate and harass me, even in and around government-owned buildings, and constant setups and framing attempts I have to repeatedly expose the truth behind on this podcast, or my life condition deteriorates even further, even more rapidly, all while having to deal with constant drama, politics, and mockery of me in passive-aggressive jabs celebrities underhandedly throw at me, and constant attempts to bring my attention to distractions that attempt to influence me to sabotage everything I've been saying and doing here. I am not lost at sea, dead, or a minor ward. I don't believe I should have to publicly display an extensive explicit proof of life certificate to substantiate the assertion that I'm the authentic living being I have been saying I am. But I'd have no issue with creating such a document and displaying it privately to anyone who I feel it's actually necessary or useful to do so too. I've never been trying to claim billions of dollars in damages from the Treasury, even if I might be legally able to do so. I'm not trying to forgive myself by hurting someone else. I'm hearing someone's claiming they're doing that to me. Probably Chloe. But I don't believe she's even actually forgiving herself at all. I believe she's just trying to hurt me for selfish gain and twist and project it any way she thinks she can to try to avoid accountability and siphon my energy entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent, forever, fully consciously and intentionally. And literally everyone else I've ever considered myself at all close to seems to just want to watch, laugh, and inflict further harm on my life unapologetically on top for their own selfish, scummy reasons, trying to benefit off me against my consent while trying to convince me and the rest of the world that I'm some extremely mentally ill, subhuman filth, criminal deserving of death. Because there's been talk of vexatious litigants with how Hassan threw around the term when referring to Ethan, I should perhaps explain how I imagine I'd pursue formal legal action in a meritorious manner. So, all the parties involved that I definitely feel more immediately qualify for civil and or criminal litigation in Canada are Chloe Chan Kin, Mary Aslin, Dixon Aslin, John Sade, and Vivian Sade, and in the United States, the Twitch streamers Angels Kimmy, iGumdrop, and perhaps also Star Smitten and X Chocobars. Based on all the evidence I've provided on this podcast, I imagine I'd have to start by suing Angels Kimmy and iGumdrop for intentional infliction of emotional distress, which would open them up to discovery, which likely would reveal they've been involved directly in defamation of me behind the scenes, and that also very well could lead into evidence for conspiracy to murder me. I imagine that discovery in general would also reveal why Star Smitten and X Chocobars have such a strange, heavy relevance to this whole thing that they ended up irrefutably proving to be part of a setup attempting to entrap me through Grand Theft Auto role-playing. I've already been saying I've never consented to marrying Vivian and haven't ever even been near her in person since childhood, and there's no real evidence otherwise, so marriage fraud and identity fraud should be rather straightforward to press charges for against her, and I imagine Mary and John can't really hide that they participated in supplying and managing the identifying documents enabling identity fraud of me that enabled the marriage fraud with Vivian and life insurance fraud with Dixon. The lawsuit against Angels Kimmy and iGumdrop should reveal further details during discovery that allows more accurate identification of exactly how to proceed in relation to Chloe. It should be noted that the egregious mistreatment and misrepresentation of me, that my gender identity is being egregiously exploited in order to enable and facilitate entirely against my consent, is criminal activity violating my rights according to Section 15 of the Canadian Charter. Egregiously defaming me and making an absolute mockery of my existence with extreme disrespect that falsely frames my authentic gender identity and expression therein on this podcast as some kind of disingenuous commercial endeavor that was ultimately intended to lead to, at least in part, doing Grand Theft Auto role-playing, while there's in reality always been absolutely zero real evidence to at all substantiate assertions otherwise, all while essentially completely discrediting everything I've been doing despite all that, most certainly is not lawful, nor have I ever at all been even attempting to give anyone the impression otherwise. Also, I've never sought spiritual protection through any sequence of numbers, nor do I plan to start, which seems particularly pertinent to perhaps mention in relation to 444. A while back, I saw something in my energy talking about me having the protection number 444, but I felt like it was actually harming me and protecting someone else at my expense against my consent. The energy talked about lingering energies from my past having a stalking type effect on my energy. I examined my surroundings and noticed a strangely, basically completely full, but opened and peculiarly positioned Pepsi bottle at the same garbage bin area of the government building I've encountered multiple setups I've mentioned before at. I didn't take it, and I didn't expect it to be there in the first place either.